Hey, I'm Chris from Make Everything, and this is my 2019 four-wheel drive Sprinter. Today we're going to be starting on a weekender camper van project. So I want to be able to take this van out and camp in it for the long weekends, or maybe spend a week out on the road, but I also need to work in it. So I've decided that I'm going to build it out in a way that I can pull in and out the camper essentials and really utilize it as both a work van and a mini RV. I think it's going to be an awesome project. The first step is going to be insulating and throwing in a roof fan. Let's get started. All right, so before we get started, a little bit of background. So this is a 2019 144 wheelbase, four-wheel drive Sprinter crew van. It's a crew van. It's got seats behind the driver's seat, and it's also got two windows and windows in the rear. It's an awesome vehicle. This is my second Sprinter. I absolutely love these things. The last Sprinter I did a bunch of traveling in, but I never spent the time to insulate it or put in an exhaust fan. This van I want to make into sort of a weekend camper van. I still move a lot of equipment and material in the truck, so I can't do a solid build out like I would normally do in a Sprinter conversion, but I want to put the basic things in here, and I want to make a modular build that I can go out on a Friday, camp for the weekend, come back, and easily get back to work on Monday. This is something that I feel a lot of people in Sprinters like to do, but it's kind of hard to find the balance between a full-blown Sprinter build out and, you know, a work van. So this will hopefully shed some light on how I'm going to do it, and I think it's going to work out really well. The first step is insulating the van, throwing in an exhaust fan. Let's get into it. So the headliner has these little pucks, these little pins. If you're ever going to do any work inside your car or anyone else's, just get yourself a set of these tools. These are like little plastic pry bars. They just make it so that these are less likely to break. I mean, you're still run a pretty good chance of breaking them just because they are really only meant to go in and out once. These ones have a little pull on them, so you can pull this little top out and it spreads this out like a molly. And then these will come out a little bit easier. Put all these together in a bin. Obviously, we're going to be putting this headliner back up. All right, so I take some time here and I take down the headliner. Now, the Sprinter headliner can be a bit of a pain. The pieces are pretty big, and since they're really just like a foam with a fabric on them, you want to be careful not to break any of them or bend them or crease them as you're pulling them out. Now, I definitely got to recommend that you go ahead and get a set of these body panel removal tools, because I broke most of the clips getting them out, and that was with the right tools. So if you didn't and you just were using like a screwdriver, I'm sure you would break all of them. The other thing I'll say is that I bought replacement body panel clips on Amazon from a quote-unquote OEM manufacturer, and they were absolutely not the same. After I did this whole thing, put the headliner back up, it started to sag, and I had to go to Mercedes to the parts department and buy new ones. They cost exactly the same, but they held way better. So once I got the headliner down, I decided to go up onto the roof and start with the exhaust fan. This is a major part of the build. You essentially have to put in an exhaust fan if you want to have any temperature control inside your van, and it's worth doing 100%. This is a bit of a scary moment, though. Moment of truth. Let's drill the first hole. So what you saw me up there with was a plastic template thing. It's like this bracket that a guy on eBay makes, and it's made out of HDPE. And basically what it does is just make sure that you hit those ribs on the roof correctly. He makes it for a couple of different vans. I'll throw a link in the description. I think it was about 60 bucks. Seemed like a lot of money for a piece of plastic like that. But honestly, this is the kind of thing that you just want to do once, and you don't really want to have to worry about, you know, saving $60 and then having a roof leak or something like that. So I drilled 4 holes in the corners, and then I used a jigsaw with a metal blade to cut open the panel. There's a lot of tolerance here. You're going to be putting in this plastic piece for the fan. It's really not a super precise operation. You just want to make sure you're in the right spot, and that little template that I bought also helps you get in the exact location no matter what. So cutting this stuff was pretty easy. I just didn't want it to fall into the van, so I put some spacers and held on to it. And just like that, I've cut a hole in the top of my $75,000 van. Once that was done, I felt like, the big pressure was over, and now you can see me putting on that plastic bracket and then putting on the actual plastic from the fan. This is a Max Air Max Fan 3500. This is their kind of top of the line fan. It's got an automatic open and close. It's got a thermostat. I think it was about $280 on Amazon. I'll throw a link to that as well. I think if you're going to spend the money to put a fan in a van like this, just spend the extra money, get the best one you can. This thing is, rain proof. It's got a guard on it. It's a really nice unit, and I've had it now for a couple of months, and it's been fantastic. Now, I just put a little bit of Rust-Oleum around that raw edge where there was no paint, just to keep any rust from ever coming up, and I started to lay out the plastic bracket that's going to go on the roof. This whole time I'm on a piece of plywood and a moving blanket to keep from creasing in my roof panel. A little bit of blue tape just helps guide where my glue is going to go. Window weld. Now the plastic piece that I got on eBay, the black piece, the person who makes that recommended a couple of different glues. The one he recommended to glue that down was a 3M product called Window Weld. It's about $20 for that tube, and you're not going to use that much of it, but it seemed to work really well. They recommended 3 beads around it, so that's exactly what I did. I had also scuffed up the paint with some Scotch-Brite before I glued it on, and then I used a bunch of squeeze clamps just to get some pressure on there to get that glue to start to set up. The stuff dried pretty quickly. It was also a nice sunny day, so that helped. And then once that glue was set up, I could go ahead and take the clamps off. The tape helped keep that glue from squeezing out too far. So this is going to be the front of the fan. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to put this is butyl tape, and I'm going to put the seam back here, probably over here, and that'll just be the start and stop point, considering that it's the back of the fan and there's going to be kind of wind-driven rain along the front. The butyl tape I actually also got from the guy that sold the black plastic piece for the roof. This stuff is super, super sticky. It's used on rubber roofing. It's like basically a super heavy double stick tape. Now I gave the plastic bracket a while to dry, and once that glue had sort of set up, I took the actual flange from the roof fan, took off the butyl tape, and stuck it down. There's also going to be some screws holding this in, so I figured those would replace the clamps while this dried, overnight and with a little more time. Now, something that I had read online from one of the van forums was a person recommended putting in some additional structure to that white plastic flange that came with the fan. So I have some 1/8 inch by 1 inch aluminum, and you'll see that I've already drilled the holes and I've rounded the corners, and essentially what that's going to do is it's going to help me stiffen up the actual assembly. Now there's going to be screws going through the aluminum, through 2 pieces of plastic, and into the sheet metal. That was recommended because over time you're going to have sun beating on this thing, most of the day, and that white plastic is going to get brittle from the UV light, and it could have a tendency of cracking. These vans flex a lot, the metal moves around, so I figured it was a good practice, and I had the material. So it's a little hard to see, but the factory screws are 1 inch long, and they're really just not long enough to properly bind on this sheet metal. So I went out and I got number 10s. These are number 8 by 1 stainless. I got number 10 by 1.5 inches. So they're going to stick a 1/2 inch down, which is fine because the headliner and the insulation is going to be there. So let's put those in, and then this will be ready to kind of set up and dry. Okay, so we got our screws in here. We're all good. We're all situated down. Now we're going to use this lap sealant, and it just goos all over this. I'm going to clean all around this with some acetone, and I guess I should scuff up a little bit too around the edges. Clean this and cover it up. Now this lap sealant is made by an RV company. I bought it on Amazon as well. I went with a black, and it's a really easy application. It actually, came out of the tube super easy and went on nice. All right, moment of truth. This essentially is what's going to seal this whole assembly. Now, you can kind of see that there's a couple levels of glue here, but this is really the top level, and this is going to be important. What's nice is I can keep an eye on it and touch it up if I have to. Now, this stuff is self-leveling, so there isn't too much I can do to make it like look nice. It kind of just globs out, and you get what you get. I had seen a bunch of videos of other people doing this, and you know, like everyone thought that I could do it and make it look nice. In the end, once it all kind of levels and wets itself out, it doesn't look bad. And honestly, the van is 9 foot off the ground, so no one's ever going to see it except for me when I go up on the roof again. Okay, so I'm going to let this kind of sit for a little bit, let it level out. And then if there's any other areas, I can go back and add some more. But so far, it looks like I got really good coverage around the whole thing. And I think it's going to adhere really well to the roof. And I think everything's going to work out good. I added a little more as that lap sealant started to settle. I wanted to make sure I had really, really good coverage. Now, while I didn't have any insulation up, I threw the headliner back up. And the purpose of this is so that I could trace it from the top to make sure that I had perfect alignment. Now, my girlfriend Angela came at this point and she was helping me out. It's definitely a lot easier to do the headliner work with 2 people because there are some clips on the side that can be a bit of a pain. And especially if you want someone to hold it up while you do any marking or measuring, it's definitely really helpful to have a second person there. Okay, so what I just did was I went up onto the roof and I traced down from the flange because I want to make sure that I cut this perfect. I don't want to have to measure. So by tracing down from the flange with this clipped in, I know that hole's going to be perfect. There is a lip around this as well. So, you know, there's some room for error, but now I can cut this and I should be good. With that tracing done, I can pull the clips back out, take the headliner down, and we can start to prepare to insulate this thing. Yeah, we have to take this all down too. All right, so I let the lap sealant cure up a bit. It's still a little soft, but I think I'm good to put the fan on for the night just so I don't get any, you know, critters or anything going in there. It just sits on like this, and then there's a couple of spots. You push it down, it seats in a gasket, and then there's a couple spots, 4 spots for screws on the side. And this thing is installed. There are these little metal clips that keep everything locked in nice and tight. Once I put this on, I didn't have to touch it again. You can see the way the lap sealant gets kind of like a flat black once it's sort of set and it's leveled out. I kept an eye on it and, you know, made sure that it didn't peel up. I gave it ample time to dry. And then we started in on taking down the headliner inside the van. Now this one is really tricky. It's essentially like a double-sized piece of headliner. There are clips on the driver's side and there's some clips on the passenger side as well where that big sliding door is. You're definitely going to want 2 people for this because, again, it's really easy to crease these things and then it just probably won't look as good. So tons of clips, get that down, get it out of the van, and start the installation. Okay, so this is the insulation we're going to be using on this. This is Havelock Wool. Now, Havelock did provide this for me, but I did a lot of research before I decided to go with this product. There's a bunch of different stuff on the market. Obviously, people think of insulation. They think of traditional pink fiberglass that you'd use in your house. There's rock mineral wool. There's denim, Insulate. There's a bunch of options on the market, but if you think about what goes into kind of preparing the surfaces after you use those alternatives, you realize that this is really the option you want to go with. So the Havelock wool is natural sheep's wool. It's actually, you know, sewn together, and it requires no vapor barrier. It's fire resistant, it's mold resistant, it's insect resistant. It's got all the boxes, checks all the boxes for me, because I just want to do this once. I don't ever want to have to go back in and check and make sure that there's, you know, no mold or anything like that. I just want to put this stuff in. I want to close back up the walls and be done with it. So The stuff is a little bit on the pricier side if you compare it to, you know, traditional insulation, but when you take out all the other things that you have to do, like, you know, adding little bits of foam or adding any reflecting material, you don't have to do any of that with this. So at the end, it actually winds up being a little less expensive, and it's only one step. So we're gonna break these down. There's actually 2 bats stuffed into this bag, and then I've got another bag like this with 2 bats stuffed into it. I'm gonna need 3 bags to do this van. It's a 144 Sprinter. That's what they recommended. We're gonna be stuffing it in all the nooks and crannies. Let's get started. So the process of insulating this is something that I'm not really familiar with, and I wasn't sure how it was gonna go. Again, this is sheep's wool, so I don't have to worry about wearing gloves or respirator or anything. Long sleeves, none of that. But it is really important to stuff all the nooks and crannies in the van. Now, once I've got the side panels and the headliner down, you can see there are tons of wells in the steel panels. So Angela got to work stuffing those with the insulation as best we could. The whole thing here is that we're trying to avoid any thermal bridges, so we don't want anywhere that's uninsulated that could then transfer heat or cold from outside into the inside cabin of the van. So all these little wells have to get stuffed up with insulation, and while she's doing that, I'm working on getting that front cabin headliner down. That's another really tricky one, along with the panel on the sliding door. Now, there are clips and screws and a bunch of things in the front headliner, and if you're actually going to do this, I recommend finding a video on YouTube that specifically goes through pulling this headliner down. I found one, and even with all that information, it was still very difficult to get out. You've got curtain airbags in the way, and it's definitely a challenge, but it's really important to insulate that from the sun and the heat. All right, so we got everything kind of tucked all up in here, all up and over here, tucked in all those little nooks and crannies. And now what we're going to do is we're just going to slide this headliner back in and try and kind of slide some pieces in up here that'll stay. I think it's going to work good. So insulating this part was very tricky. It was probably the hardest section to get done. So we tried laying a strip of insulation on it and then sliding that headliner back in. It's a pretty tight pressure fit, and you've also got body clips you have to work on and stuff like that. So we're kind of stuffing insulation in as we go. I'm standing on like a little apple box so that I can see what I'm doing. And then we're going to basically pressure all this insulation up into that headliner piece, lock the clips back in, put all the screws back in, and then try to reassemble the light and the other stuff. There are mat pockets up there and some sunshades. This was definitely the most involved piece in the installation process. But if you think about it, you know, on a Sprinter, you've got that kind of big forehead on the top above the windshield. And when you're driving towards the sun or parked out in a parking lot, that thing just bakes. If you leave your car out in the sun, you know, prior to installation, and you reach your hand up there after a hot sunny day, you'll feel the amount of heat that sits up there. My van is like a super dark gray, almost black, so it definitely doesn't help with the heat, and having that little bit thermally isolated is going to be really helpful. There are some Torx screws that hold up the sunshades, so I put those back in, and once all that stuff was back in, all these different components help hold that headliner in place and lock it in. Now, the other big reason to do this is to reduce road noise, and having some insulation on the front of the vehicle like that, where you've got a lot of wind resistance, definitely helps a lot. I did some decibel readings before I started this project, and I was reading like in the 80 to 90 decibel range when we were driving on the highway, which is pretty loud. Now we're moving over to the passenger door, and there's a kind of vinyl wrap panel there that I had just pulled off. That one's easy. Stuff it up with insulation, snap the panel back on. And then on the rear sections of the van where you could potentially have windows, there are some nice big open sections that we threw some insulation in. Again, always up on the top and the sides. We made sure to pack in all that stuff. Now you can see I'm starting to run some strings across the welts and the support beams on the ceiling. This is something that Havelock recommends in order to keep the insulation up. You can use tape, but I found it pretty difficult considering there was so much wool fiber hanging out in the air. Every time I would pull a piece of tape off, some wool would get on it and it wouldn't stick. So I shot some strings across and kind of made this drape system, which just held that insulation in place in between the ribbing so that we could start to get the headliner up. This one was also pretty difficult to get in place considering that it's so big. But once we kind of got a couple pieces of it snapped in, you're able to kind of bend and force it into place. And it also, all these headliners lock into one another. So we have the front one up, and then we sort of, push this one up into place and start pushing it in. Now, I mentioned earlier that I had bought some OEM clips on Amazon to replace the headliner clips that were lost. And this was an area where we really needed to have strong clips. So that headliner wound up sagging. And after this was all done, about a month later, I wound up having to essentially take it down and reinstall the proper clip. So if you are going to do this, head to your local Mercedes dealer, ask them for some headliner clips. Buy probably 20 before you start, because you'll probably break 20 doing this. Similar process here for the door. The vinyl pad comes off. You can see the removal process here. You basically just snap it off with a little plastic pry bar, and then you stuff up these nice big wells filled with insulation, and you basically want to add as much insulation as the well will hold. I spoke to the guys at Havelock before I started this project, and I asked them, this bats of insulation are about an inch thick. Is that how thick I want to go? And their answer was, as much as it'll take, that's how much you should give it. So Angela did her best to stuff it up into all the corners, all the wells, all the areas that we couldn't see. They are all stuffed solid with insulation, and you can definitely notice the road noise difference in the cabin. Moving towards the back, there are these kind of plastic panels that came in the van, and I want to replace them with plywood. So what better way to get a template than to use the existing panels that are there? I decided to add 2 inches to the top of them because they are a little bit low. And these are just going to be great because they're going to give me a space that I can screw shelving into or screw other pieces into if I want to make a bed platform and anything else. Now this is a 3/4 inch Ariata pine from Home Depot. These are about $35 to $40 a sheet. It's a really nice plywood alternative from like a Baltic birch. It's pretty smooth on one side and it's pretty durable. If you've watched any of my other van videos or cabinet videos, you've probably seen me use this stuff. I use it all the time and it's been really great. Paints up well and cuts super nice. So after tracing those 2 pieces on, I'm going to use a combination of the track saw and a jigsaw to cut these pieces out and just try to make them as clean as possible. The idea here is to make these panels look like they're factory installed, and I definitely achieve that. Most people, when they see the inside of the van, ask me if it came with these wooden panels as opposed to the plastic. I used a 1/4 inch round over on all the edges just to clean them up and make them nice and soft. And then we used a Behr Ultra Premium paint from Home Depot. It was about $60 for the gallon in a very dark charcoal gray. We made sure to paint both of the back and the front because I didn't want them to warp as the paint dried. And we did 2 coats on all of the panels. This definitely improves the dead sound in the van as well, because now you've got essentially an insulated wall with a plywood front on it, and that makes a big difference when it comes to keeping road noise down while you're driving. Now the way I attach these panels is with some self-tapping number 10 screws with a hex head. Now I'm able to look at the other side of the van so I can see where all the support beams would be. And I also made sure to check to make sure that these screw tips wouldn't dimple the outside sheet metal when I put them in. I want to say that I used 1 inch screws or 1 1/4 screws on this because I had to go through 3/4 material and then through the sheet metal. So I put this section of headliner back up, and the reason is in my last van I had some shelves up here, and they were really, really helpful to have just for little things like straps and extra clothes, jackets, whatever. In a camping aspect they're great, and also in like a work van aspect they're great, just to keep things up off the floor. So anyway, you can see if I were to put a shelf on here and screw it in and hit the sheet metal, I'm going to crush the headliner. So you've got to put some framing behind here. Now the best way to kind of figure that out, I found, is to put a piece of headliner up and measure off the rib. So I've got about 1 1/4 inch gap here, and then 1 1.5 inch gap up there. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to cut up some material, and I'm going to put in essentially studs back here, 48 inches long, maybe even a little bit longer. And that's what's gonna allow me to screw through the headliner into it and not crush the headliner. So really I'm just trying to add a little bit of background support. Now that I got those dimensions, I can take this piece back down, put those studs in, and I can continue to insulate and put everything back up. Even if you're not planning on doing shelves, I still recommend, if you get your headliner down, to put some sort of framing material behind this section. It's even good if you just want to have coat hooks or something. The gap between the headliner and the metal framing here in the van, it's just kind of annoying. There's really no way to attach anything to this headliner if you don't put material back there. So this is just a 2x4 that I ripped, and again, I'm using some longer self-tapping screws to get that in there nice and solid. And you may have to use a clamp to get this tight prior to actually putting the screws in, because it does take a good amount of force to get through those ribs. The sheet metal up here that's supporting it is pretty thick, and you're going to want to have to put some shoulder behind it in order to get them to tap. Now moving back towards the back of the van, you can see I put some more string up, and I'm just kind of putting in insulation, trying to make a nice continuous section, stuffing it in between the studs that I put in, and putting the headliner pieces up one at a time as I go. You can see the way they sort of tuck into one another, and then they lock back in up at the top. And you don't have to worry about those strings getting in the way later. So this is the headliner that's going to have the hole cut in it for the flange for the roof fan. So before I put the actual fan unit in the opening, I put this headliner back up and I traced it from the roof because I didn't want to have to measure this out. So now this is the actual flange piece that goes in from the bottom. I checked this. I'm going to cut it a little bit oversized so I have some room to wiggle around. And what's nice is that I'm not going to hit my light either. The factory light is not going to be impacted. It's not going to cause like a weird gap. So I traced this on there. Now I'm going to cut this. I'm going to try cutting it with the angle grinder because I don't want to rip the fabric. And I feel like the jigsaw might rip it. So we'll see how it goes. It might be really smoky and horrible. Yeah, it is. So using the jigsaw actually worked out pretty well. I had a pretty fine-tooth blade on there because I didn't want to fray out the actual headliner fabric, but cutting through all this foam was pretty easy. And you can see it's a little bit thicker over there on the side so it doesn't bang against the roof of the van, but it worked out fine. So yeah, I cut it a little oversized. I've got room to move around now. And then this piece is going to get screwed into the headliner, and then I'll probably wind up trying to figure out some way to attach this because I feel like my headliner is probably going to sag because I cut out all this support. This will be supported, and that might be too. I don't know, we'll see. If it does wind up sagging, it's not a big deal. All right, let's throw that insulation up, then this can go up. You can see it. This is 2 bats compressed. And this is what 2 bats look like once you open them and some air gets in there. So this is split evenly down the middle. And that's, essentially what 1 bat would look like. So if you go to do your 144 Sprinter, you'll get 3 of those. And you should have more than enough. I'm about to finish. I have 2 headliner pieces to go and 2 wall panels. And that's, I'm just now breaking into the 3rd bat. So I think I'm going to have plenty, and I should have some left over to maybe make like some window covers that are filled with insulation. So with that hole cut in that piece of headliner, I'm going to continue on. The other nice thing about this product is that you can easily cut it with a pair of scissors. You can see me kind of cutting these pieces into shape and making sure that they get up on the ceiling nice and go around my fan. Now, again, Havelock recommends that if you're going to do this and you're going to insulate your van, you absolutely put in some sort of exhaust. The idea here is that the wool is going to help you maintain the temperature inside the van and keep it at a comfortable, level. So if you have no way to exhaust heat or, bring in cool air, it's going to be very difficult to do that. What's nice about this particular fan is it's got a bug screen on it. It automatically opens and closes. It's totally rainproof, and it's just super nice. What I usually do is I set a temperature on the thermostat, and then as the van is sitting in the sun during the day, it'll automatically open the fan, turn it on, set the speed, and then once the van gets to the temperature that I've set, it'll close the fan and shut off. Something else I'm doing as I'm putting up the headliner pieces is I'm putting some blue tape to mark out where those studs that I put behind the headliner are. This is going to be really helpful when I make my shelves, and I won't have to go looking for those studs. It's pretty easy to get this plastic flange in. You just kind of mark it up in place, but you do have to cut it depending on the thickness of your roof. So I just marked it before I ran the cable down the column so that I could cut it at the right depth. In the rear column of the van is a 12-volt cigarette socket, and I'm going to tap into that power to run the fan. There's a dedicated fuse that runs off my second battery, which will help power the fan and keep my main battery from getting drained if the fan's running all day. To cut the plastic flange, I just use an angle grinder, and I rip around the sides to cut it, pull it off, clean up those edges with a knife, and then this will push up into place. Now, the first time I put this up, I just threw some screws up into the headliner itself. That worked for about a month, and then those screws pulled out because they're basically screwed into fabric. So what I did was I went back and I hot glued some blocking into the headliner and then screwed into those. The last thing I'm going to do is I'm going to make some wooden panels for the side here to protect the sheet metal and give me a place to insulate. The last Sprinter that I had, about 2 weeks after I got it, I was on a material run for a job, and a bunch of material fell over inside the van and hit the inside of that sheet metal and dented it from the inside out, and it broke my heart. So it was really important to put some plywood up in the last van, and this one is pretty new, so I'm going to make sure that I do it before I have a chance to damage these panels. These are also a really good way to mount things to the sidewalls of the van. It protects the sheet metal, gives you a great socket for more insulation, and it's pretty easy to do. These are essentially going to be rectangles with a little notch cut out to meet the headliner. So you'll see how I'm going to mark out the headliner based on what's there. I throw a piece of cardboard up it and I trace it. Then I bring that piece of cardboard over to the plywood. I cut it out with a scissor and I lay it on the plywood in the right orientation so that I can mark it out with a pencil and cut it out. I'm just going to use the jigsaw to cut around this curve and try to make it nice. And all I need to do is do this once. Once this one piece fits in, the other side is identical, and I'll be able to just match it and cut it again. I leave a little gap on the bottom and the top so that I can get some straps or bungee cords in there because it's going to be nice to strap things down to this. You know, I could put a bungee net on it so that I could put clothes in it while I'm traveling or anything like that. Just like the bottom pieces, I ran a round over bit around the whole thing, blew these off, and painted both sides. If you're ever going to paint plywood panels, it's always important to also paint the back as well as the front. You don't have to do 2 coats on the back, but if you just paint the front of a piece of plywood, as the paint dries, it'll contract the fibers in the wood, and normally the paint will bow towards the paint. The wood will bow towards the paint. So you always want to make sure you paint both sides of a panel, especially with a thick encapsulating paint like this. You want to make sure that you don't warp those pieces. It'll be very hard to correct that warp. In between coats, I do a little light sanding, and then I go ahead and add a second coat. Now I need to have a place for the insulation to go, so I temporarily mount these panels, and then I make some marks as to where I can start and stop some wooden blocking on the backside to keep the insulation from falling out the bottom and to keep it from coming out the top. I also check my dimension off the bottom panel and come up with a set number so that when I put these up, they can be in exactly the same spot. I make up some pieces. They're about 1.5 inches deep, and that's going to just help get into that recess. I throw them on with glue and some brad nails, and that's going to give me a super nice area to put the insulation. These sidewalls of the van get super hot during the day, so it's really important to get a nice insulation barrier in there. I lay down a couple pieces to figure out what size they need to be, and I'm very easy to cut them with the scissor. And I can actually double these up and make this panel nice and thick and really stuff it in there. At this point, this is the last piece I have to do, so I'm not worried about using maybe a little extra insulation to do a better job in this little section. And now I just take some string and I kind of weave this X pattern across the whole thing with a staple gun to make sure that everything is locked in so that when I put these up, they don't sag. Now you can see the area that I'm trying to fill, and you can see that little notch. I make some little blocks, and that's what I'm going to sit the panel on while I screw it in. And maybe these weren't the best. They fell out a couple times, which was a little annoying, but it's better than trying to do it by just floating it in place. I really want this to look nice and clean. You can see how even it looks off the bottom panel. And honestly, when this is done, you wouldn't even be able to tell that these weren't factory panels. The charcoal gray came out awesome. The paint held up really well. I did scuff this one up a little bit, but what's nice about this is I bought a gallon of paint. I used about half of it, and I can go back and touch this up super easy. It's a zero VOC paint. I can throw a link to that in the description from the Home Depot as well. So with that panel done, the insulation and the roof fan is 100% complete. I'm super happy with the way this came out. Now, the other benefit of this plywood is you can mount and dismount things from this all you want. And if you wanted to make something that had a thread in it, you could easily just hammer in some T-nuts. You could take these panels off, put T-nuts on the backside, and you could do a ton of work with it. The fan is absolutely essential, and this is going to be an awesome base to build this weekender camper sprinter out of. So the other thing that I added after I insulated the van was all this garbage. But other than that were these screens. These are magnetic screens. You would buy them for a set of patio doors. I could put links in the description to the ones that I ordered. They worked really well in the van base. You stick on some Velcro and they worked out great. I had to cut these down. I just cut them with a scissor and used some tape to mend the bottom. I also got one for the sliding door, and they're so great to keep the bugs out when you're out camping. The light is going to draw in every mosquito and moth in like a freaking mile radius, so having screens is essential. They work out awesome, and it cost me about 60 bucks to do both doors. So something I added after the build was done as well is this accessory for the fan. This is a little light, and it also has a reflective sunshade in it. So on the back side of this is kind of like a foil, and when you're sleeping, if you have a really harsh sunlight in the morning, this will block it out. It does restrict the airflow to these two little strips, but it worked out really nice, and it's been great for trying to sleep in the morning if it's on a sunny day, and the little extra light is helpful too. It's kind of plug and play. I ordered it right from Max Fan. I think I found it on Amazon as well, so I'll throw a link to that there in the description. All right, that about does it for this video. I've been driving around with the insulation in the truck for a couple of months now, and it's really made a big difference in the way the vehicle drives in terms of how loud it is while you're in the cab and driving on the highway. So it used to be so loud that I felt like I had to yell when I was on the phone while I was driving. Now with the insulation, it's definitely deadened the sound in the van by a lot. The other thing I've noticed is the way that the heat is able to be dispersed from the van, now that I have the fan and the insulation, is dramatically different. Once the van is cool, it stays cool longer. I don't have heat up on the headliner anymore or on the sidewalls. One of the things though is that still having these exposed windows, I definitely get a lot of heat coming in from those, so I try to cover them when we're out camping. We've taken this on a bunch of trips, and all of them have worked out really well, having the exhaust fan able to blow air out or pull cool air in, and it's really been great. I've got some shelves in now, which have made a huge difference, and I used those studs that I put behind the headliner, which worked out awesome. I'm going to be doing a little video on the shelves and some more videos on the other build-outs that I've done in the van coming up soon. So the purpose here, like I said, is to make kind of a weekender camping van. I move a lot of machines using my truck, and I also bring tools with me everywhere, so I can't build out like a solid sprinter conversion like a lot of people do. The goal here is to make something super modular that, you know, we can put a bed in for the weekend, take the seats out, go out camping, spend a couple days out living off the grid in the van, and it'll still be comfortable and really functional. The insulation and the fan are the first step. They're absolutely critical, and they made a huge difference here. Thank you to Havelock for supporting this video and sending me the insulation, which is an absolute amazing product. I really, really enjoyed using it. I've recommended it to a bunch of friends, and if you follow the link down in the description, you can check it out. I really appreciate it if you would go through that link. If you have any questions, ask them down in the comments below. Reach out to the people at Havelock too. They were super, super helpful, and they really guided me anytime I had a question. So thank you to them. And thank you guys for watching this video. If you want to see more in this little van series as I build this out, don't forget to subscribe, give the video a thumbs up, and I hope to see you on the next one. Thanks.